Okay, so Michael, I'll start back in 1967. You were called to the bar. You've had a long career, almost 6 decades, fighting injustice and corruption. Your name is synonymous with many of the biggest human rights cases during that period, from the Birmingham Six, the Bloody Sunday, Ballymurphy, Stephen Lawrence and Grenfell. But tonight we're going to focus obviously on Palestine, and before I come to the current events and the horrific scenes we're all witnessing, I just want to talk a wee bit about your own family and personal connections with Palestine. Go back to 1917. Your father was a British soldier who fought to liberate Palestine from the Ottoman Empire. So maybe start there and we'll move along.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming as well. Excuse my voice. It's because I have to work for him all the time, you see, so I'm getting very hoarse. Sorry about that. If you can't hear, just say and I'll try and make it louder. No, Palestine has meant a great deal, in fact, and I think unconsciously, because when I was young I didn't quite grasp the significance of what my father was saying. I mean, he was fairly withdrawn a lot of the time, so he was not a great conversationalist, but he never talked about the disability that he'd got, the disability being he'd only got one leg, and he always used to say he'd lost the other one. But then when you probe, well, what do you mean you lost it, you know? And then he would occasionally, but not in great detail, I discovered that his brother and the rest of that generation were actually brought up and lived in Palestine. So I sort of began to ask some questions. Many of them after he died in 1960, so it's a long time ago. And I hadn't really probed enough, but what I did discover by looking at diaries, and I found photographs, is that he and his brother had joined the City of London Yeomanry, which, despite its title, is the mounted division of the British Army. And that he was, at the age of about 17, 18, he's not quite a boy soldier, but he's very young. And he'd already met my mother and they were planning to get married, so it's one of those extraordinary situations in which he goes off to war in the mounted division as part of General Allenby's army. Now, again, without looking it up, nobody's going to remember, I don't suppose anybody here would necessarily remember, I don't, General Allenby and the role he played, and what the British Army was trying to do, alongside the French and all the usual culprits, the French, the Russians, and so on. But Allenby had a particular purpose, and of course, this is where, I suppose those of you who've heard of Lawrence of Arabia, fits into this narrative in this portion. So he's part of the mounted division heading out of Egypt across Sinai up towards Palestine. And his vision, inasmuch as soldiers have a vision of anything other than, you know, the immediate future, his belief was that they'd been sent there to liberate Palestine from the Ottoman Empire. That was his belief. That's what I was brought up to understand from him. The little he talked about it, but I got that much. However, on the way, as it were, from Cairo northwards, up the coast, if you can visualize it on a map, heading towards Palestine and the Ottoman Empire, he, along with a lot of other British soldiers, obviously at that time, was shot and given up for dead. His horse was dead, he was laying in the sand, he did describe that much. And it was at that point that somebody must have come back for him, and he was taken back to Cairo. Got photographs of him in this, sepia photographs of him sitting in a hospital bed in Cairo, where they amputated. They had to not waste any time, otherwise he would have been dead altogether. He'd lost a lot of blood. So from the age of 17, he's gone through a traumatic event, and the rest of his life changes, because of course, as you appreciate, it's not so easy to do what you need to do when you've only got one leg and all the rest of it. He made fun of it, but I was brought up with that. But I was also brought up with something else, which was an anger he had inside him, which he transferred to me. And that was, he said, I nearly died on a mission to liberate Palestine. Meanwhile, while I'm on the front line, what are the British politicians doing? Well, I think you all know probably what the British politicians are doing. Well, I remember, perhaps you forgive me for just advertising a little book that I've got coming, that's out at the moment in your local bookshop. And if you're very clever, you might get 2 for the price of 1. But it's The Power in the People is the title, but it's the bit at the bottom, not the people in power. Not the people in power. And we're going to come to all of you and the civil society to which you are a member. So he was devastated by the fact the British government were actually doing double deals. Perfidious Albion, yet again. They were negotiating with members of the Jewish community as well as the Arab, promising through Lawrence of Arabia and other people all sorts of things for a Palestinian state, but doing the same thing with the Jews as well. And of course there's the famous Balfour Declaration, which is an ignominious part of our history. So my father was very cross about all of that, very angry about all of that. His brother stayed on in Palestine to help with the British mandate. And of course then, lo and behold, the people who they'd been negotiating with, namely the Jews, the Jewish community, gave rise to terrorism. And they started attacking British troops. So they got it both ways, which made, well, my father wasn't out there then, but the history, therefore, meant a great deal to him. And gradually, over the years, I've sort of realised that it sort of seeped through into the very veins of my life. That, well, we'll come to it in a minute, but as a result, I've been to Palestine 3 times, and I've got some pretty vivid experiences as a result of that. But that's the connection I've got, and why I'm so passionate about it, because his life and mine are intertwined, and I've been to Palestine, as I say, and I've seen at ground level, this was some time ago, but it hasn't changed, it's got worse. So I'm deeply involved, and it will be an overstatement to say I can't sleep at night because of it, but I find it very difficult at the moment. I force myself to watch the scene, because this is, humanity is indivisible, and basically what's going on there affects me here, affects you sitting in the seat, I'm sure.
Well, I want to just come to that, your visits to Palestine, and that was part of the Russell Tribunal, set up in March 2009. Maybe you could explain the concept of the
Yes,
Russell
it is all, there's a shorter version in the book, I'll try and do it quickly, but it's very important. One of the things that, as a lawyer, I've learned is that, again, not the people in power. You can't trust any of them, never mind Palestine, all sorts of situations. And I'll just come quickly now. Today, they lose in the Supreme Court. Hands down, absolutely, 5 judges no to Rwanda. What's their reaction? And this is why I'm so anxious about the present situation. What you're getting now, and you've been getting over the last few years, is politicians turning around and saying, stuff the rule of law. It doesn't mean anything. We'll ignore it, just as Israel has ignored the United Nations for 30, 40, 50 years. And what some Tories are now saying, which is what Boris led the way on this, we'll leave Europe without, getting the House of Commons, we'll prorogue House of Commons, it's getting in the way, we'll hold parties, and when I'm found out, I'll just leave. So the rule of law, which matters to us as lawyers, because we haven't got much else, that's what we're here for. And so there came a time, long before all of this in Palestine, when certain people realised that this was going on in generations before the one we've got at the moment, we'll just send them on the planes anyway and stuff the court, the Supreme Court. Now, in other words, it is diminishing the rule of law and saying basically it doesn't. As part of the, if you like, the paradigm for a civilized society is you have got an element of law which you abide by and you approve of, and in a democratic society you should, obviously, you'll be voting for it and all the rest of it. So I think that the situation, therefore, recognised generations ago by a philosopher called Bertrand Russell, who again you'll have heard of probably, and he recognised, decades ago, that politicians then were doing what they're doing now, which is ignoring the rule of law. Therefore, what he said was, we, the citizens of the world, have to establish an alternative system to do the job they're not doing, to point out the violations of international law then. And the first major one, there were a number of others, but the one you may have heard of was the Russell Tribunal on Vietnam, where he got together a number of very well-known people at that time, including Jean-Paul Sartre and other, political... You can answer it, it's fine. It's probably the special branch, if they still exist, or somebody trying to do it. So there's a situation in which he was saying, we as citizens, we don't have to put up with this. And the meetings I've been to regularly, I get the feeling, both here and in London and elsewhere where I've been, with the book mainly, but other things as well, is that there is a feeling afoot with everybody that they've had enough. Here, you haven't even got people in power, so in a sense you've got a different situation. However, the feeling is one of anger, and you've got to do something about it. So what Bertrand Russell did, he assembled this tribunal, run like a court, run like a tribunal of inquiry. He called it a citizens' commission. And they looked at what the Americans and others were doing in Vietnam, and of course they indicated where the violations of international laws that stood then had taken place. Now this was very instrumental. Don't worry, we can all join in if you like. Maybe put it on loudspeaker. And so therefore, once he'd identified all the breaches of international law at that time, that the American public began to realize how bad it was that they'd been involved in this war in the way that they were involved, and the orange, the napalm and all the rest of it they were using. And it played a role in changing American policy. Along comes Russell, by this time Bertrand Russell's dead, but another man comes onto the scene, to whom I've dedicated the book, a man you won't have heard of necessarily, I haven't, called Stefan Hessel. Stefan Hessel was a German Jew, obviously left during the war. He was locked up twice in concentration camps. He escaped twice, the death warrant out for him, he survived. And at the end of the war, the French government said to him that they would like him to be an envoy to the United Nations, because that's the time at which the United Nations was beginning to grow out of the situation. In other words, people were getting together and saying, never again must we have the kind of war they just had. Never again, that was the idea. So he, Stefan Hessel, and Eleanor Roosevelt and a large number of other people got together and they said, right, we're going to construct a mechanism in the hope and the belief that we can not allow wars to develop in the way that they have in the Second World War and the First World War. So that's why the United Nations, in a sense, was born, incorporating into it your right to self-defense, but not at any price. Not, you can do what you like to defend yourself. It's just saying you can defend yourself, but only for a little while, because we, the United Nations, we're going to step in. And after we get a force together, we're going to have a peacekeeping force to stop whichever two sides there are, or three sides or four sides, conducting armed conflict. That was the idea, physically intervene. And of course, as you know, that hasn't actually been a very successful story. But the real problem, which resides within the United Nations, and it percolates right the way through to what's happening now, is that the governing body is the Security Council. Personally, I think all of this has got to change if we're ever going to get a future worth it. Because all that happens is, you get America on one side, Russia on the other side, and the French wavering, and of course you can guess what the Brits do every single time, which is abstain. So they're in the middle. They don't vote either way. And so each thing gets blocked, as it has over the ceasefire. They can't even get a ceasefire through the Security Council because Russia blocks the American version, the Americans block the Russian version. And it's a farce. It's a Whitehall farce that's going on. So that's got to change. Meanwhile, what was interesting at the moment is when the General Assembly met recently, overwhelming in favour of ceasefire. So the global population, if you like, people who are saying we've got to change the system in the United Nations so that there's greater diversity and the power is spread in a completely different way. And of course those in power are not going to change it, are they, too readily? But that situation has persisted ever since Stefan and others tried to set it up. Now what he did in our case was to visit Palestine, which I did 3 times, to see what was going on the ground and to identify where the violations were occurring. I went in 2009, did 5 years. We went all around the world. We went to Barcelona, we went to South Africa where apartheid, and obviously that has a bearing on the Israel-Palestine situation. And it was quite clear there were serious violations then. The main one we concluded was apartheid. And we got a lot of stick. We were being called anti-Semitic because we even talked about it. Of course now everybody's talking about it, and now it's become an accepted term within, not by Israel, but by a lot of the world recognised. That's what's been going on in the occupied territories, remember, occupied all that period of time. And there are certain rights that are attendant upon occupation, which is the right of self-determination, the right to resist an occupation that is illegal. And this is extremely important for what Stefan was saying. He was saying, no, it wasn't a call to arms, it was a call to lawyers and the civil population to say, this cannot go on, because my father predicted that the Third World War is going to come out of this situation in the Middle East. That's what he was saying. And in a sense, you see how close we are to it in that relationship. But what Stefan said was, well, we're going to persuade all sorts of governments that we're doing the right thing and identifying it. And unless these violations stop, illegal occupation stops, and all the oppression stops, unless it stops and is recognised to be, outside the law effectively, then there's no point in the United Nations, there's no point in everything we've been trying to do as lawyers. And the pinnacle, and why I say what he had in mind worked in the end, and this is a part of the wall that we constructed, was that we got a hearing at the United Nations as a tribunal. And I was the spokesperson for the tribunal at the United Nations, not the Security Council, the General Assembly. At a crucial time, when one of the big wrangles is Palestine isn't a state, therefore it can't do this and it can't do that, and it can't, coming to the ICC, can't actually end up at the ICC. Well, we recognised we've got to change that. And so at the time we went in 2012, November, we were part of, we weren't the main one, but like the Vietnam Tribunal, the Assembly voted in favour for the first time that Palestine should be recognised, not as a member state, because again you've got to tread carefully, but as an observer state. So it got statehood, incredibly important, because the next stage, and I know that my dear friend Paddy has brought some other dates here, is that once they got statehood in that sense, they were then able to go to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which had been set up through the Treaty of Rome in 1998, come into force by 2002, where it could try international crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity and so on. So they then, Palestine, accepted the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, really important, which meant that the court could examine international crimes committed on the soil of Palestine. And a very important decision that the court made very recently, and in fact Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor, who I know quite well, he indicated 2-3 weeks ago, and I know Paddy's brought the statement he made it very clear that the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court covers the whole of Palestine, Gaza, the occupied territories, but Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem. And in other words, that they are entitled to look at. And so the question we're eventually coming to is obviously, so now what happens? So the point I'm making is that our civil tribunal, Russell Tribunal on Palestine, was part of the important history of getting Palestine into a situation in which we should have an international criminal court which is active. So turn aside from the ceasefire for a moment. Who is going to the International Criminal Court right now and saying, not stop it, look at what you've already done. And what's already happened are well documented, crimes, violations of international law that are very obvious to everybody as to what they are. What is happening at the moment? Nothing. And that's where we come to, your role, my role, is to try and get something moving at the ICC in The Hague.
Yeah, I just wanted to come to that. And just a few dates. The Government of Palestine on the 1st of January 2015 lodged a declaration of their own statute under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, alleging crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, since June 13, 2014. That referral was accepted by the prosecutor, Karim Khan. We'll talk a wee bit more about later. And he opened a preliminary examination on the 16th of January 15. Fast forward to 2019, he concluded the preliminary examination with the determination that all statutory criteria under their own statute for the opening of a formal investigation had been met. And in March 2021, the prosecutor announced the opening of the investigation. And I think, as you said, in recent weeks, he has confirmed that 2021 investigation covers the situation in Gaza at the minute. So I just wanted to explore international human rights law. So with the ICC, which you've talked a wee bit about, and the other possibility is the Genocide Convention as well, which is another possibility that can be, or any state can bring. So maybe we could talk a wee bit about that to the international, a separate international court. As well.
International Court of Justice,
yeah.
the ICJ, that's also at The Hague. I don't want to make it too technical because I've amused myself, don't worry, I don't necessarily remember what it's all about. But there are two organisations, basically, two courts. International Court of Justice, set up in 1998. Alongside it, a different building, the International Court of Justice actually comes out of a previous situation in the League of Nations after the First World War. Now, the International Court of Justice is important but quite different. It adjudicates between states. So if you've got a border dispute between states, you take it to the International Court. It's called the World Court, that's how it's also called, because it deals with these global situations. And it will adjudicate and it will bring forth a judgment, which isn't binding in the sense that it's really almost advisory. And of course, Israel's treated it like that because there's a very important judgment coming out of the International Court of Justice. It's called the Wall. That's how it's called, the judgment. So if you ever need to find it, just Google the Wall, Israel. It'll come up. It's a completely, I usually carry it with me, but there's too much to carry around at the moment, so I haven't brought it. And people go, what, you're going to read from a judgment? And I do, because people understand. Because what the judges said, 15 judges, one against, you can guess the one against, that was Israel. But every other judge in that tribunal, or that court, passed judgment on this wall. Now the wall is called the Wall of Separation. One tends to forget, it's been there always, like a Berlin Wall. I've been there. They built it right the way through Palestinian property, houses. Gardens is another thing altogether, but right through their houses, and made it extremely difficult for families who got divided, or certainly for Palestinians, to go across the wall. You can't. You have to go through special gates, and it's a palaver. You queue up for hours in the heat, and they make life really difficult. So the court said this was unlawful. They should never have done that. They weren't, and they talk about apartheid in the judgment. They talk about the fact that the settlements are illegal in the judgment. So a world court has already adjudicated, it's 2004 is the year when this judgment came out. Extremely important judgment. And furthermore, what the court said was, we as world citizens, we have an obligation to put pressure on Israel to take the wall down. And what did Israel do? Built more wall. What did the rest of the governments of the world do? Pretty well nothing. They've all recognised it, but it never, they're very quick to say Hamas, who is a terrorist organisation designated by the United Kingdom, they don't bring up the wall judgment. They don't bring up what the judges were saying had been happening long before what is happening now. So the International Court of Justice is another way, but it has to be, the International Court of Justice has to be through a state. So a state would have to bring another case in front of the International Court concerning the present situation. That's more difficult because, maybe a bit south of the border here might be prepared to do it, but the British government aren't going to take any case to the International Court of Justice, unfortunately, but they should, because genocide is, you don't have to wait for it to be completed. If it's beginning to happen, then that's a case that should be going. But under the Geneva Conventions, never mind, it's also ICC, but that's clearly one of the things that is capable of being heard by the World Court, where genocide is being committed, or the seeds of genocide can be discerned, which is equivalent to ethnic cleansing in Gaza and elsewhere. So the International Court of Justice is an important organ, but you have to get a government to be active. The difference with the ICC is it isn't dependent on a government, because it's individual responsibility. The whole point about the International Criminal Court was identifying people responsible for pulling the trigger, not just the ones who give the orders, but the ones on the ground as well. And the approach to the court can be made by us. And what it's called, and it's in the news at the moment, because there's a team of French lawyers doing this. There are American lawyers doing this as well, beginning to and I think we as a community have to do the same, whether it's the Irish community or the English community or Scottish or the Welsh, whatever. We have as a community a responsibility for what's happening there, and to try and stop it is to approach the prosecutor. Now, a government a member state can approach the prosecutor and say there's been Palestine could, I'm not quite sure why they haven't done this, but they haven't. They could approach the prosecutor and say, we want to prosecute, what are you doing about all this? Have you got people out here observing what's going on all over? But they haven't done it. Some of the Arab states could do the same. But besides, obviously, a state approaching the prosecutor, the Security Council can say to the prosecutor, hey, get out there and do something about it. But they're not going to do anything because they're split all the time. They'll never get a decision out of them. So there are very few options left. They're called NGOs, and I'm sure you know what that means, but the prosecutor is bound to take more account of an NGO. Now, the French lawyers have approached the prosecutor and said there are 3 humanitarian agencies in Gaza that have been seriously affected. We want you, the prosecutor, and it's called a communication, but if you want a clearer word, it's called a complaint. So the French lawyers, on behalf of 3 humanitarian organisations, have approached the prosecutor and said, get on with this. These are clear violations. These agencies have suffered in a way they should never have suffered. Now, they put that in last week, so it's slow off the mark, but it's better late than never. and we're even so. We've got to be on the ball on this one and almost shame the prosecutor into getting on with the job. I know it's dangerous. I know it's difficult. What's the point of the United Nations? What's the point of the ICC if it doesn't act under these circumstances? And we have an example which would make it difficult for him to say, if he wants to say no, he'll say no. But he's already done it in relation to the Ukraine. He's actually issued arrest warrants, not just for the minions on the ground in Ukraine. There's an arrest warrant for Putin. This is extremely important because over and above it being a sort of gesture, and I hope it isn't just that, on the ground practically it means he can't travel anywhere and he runs the risk of getting arrested. Now, the same thing should happen in the conflict in the Middle East. Those, and I'm not restricting it to Israel, those who commit crimes against international law, and I include, obviously, those who are going under the banner of Hamas. The obvious one is they should be taking hostages, and I'm relieved to know some more have been released tonight, but they shouldn't have been taking hostages. That's a crime. So I'm not saying we just look in one direction, we don't. As lawyers, you have to have obviously an independent and an objective view of what's going on. So I don't exclude, it's just that at the moment, what's going on is not only holding hostages, but obviously annihilation, almost, of a complete country. So approaching the prosecutor in this way, through an NGO, or it could be, for all I know, Palestinians, I know one of them who live here, you can act on their behalf, and when it's an NGO, what the prosecutor has to do, I won't go through all the procedure, when it's an NGO or a group of citizens who approach him, to him at the moment, obviously with Karim, he has to go to the chamber of the court, the pre-trial chamber, and say, hey, look, I've been approached by all these people, is it okay for me to, and then he has to examine it, but he has to get permission to do it, whereas if it comes to the Security Council, he doesn't have to do that. Anyway, he has a bit of a procedure to go through. He gets permission, and then as with Paddy's example in 2014, he, having got permission, he then opens an examination, a preliminary examination to make sure about jurisdiction, the gravity of the offence, evidence available, and all that kind of thing. And then once he's examined it at a sort of peripheral level, if there is an apparent case to be investigated, then he inaugurates an investigation. I know it's long-winded, but it's meant to be bringing about an element of justice, so it's going to take a bit of time to do it properly. But these wheels have got to start turning now, and those who are committing offences now must recognise they have to be in the longer run accountable. That's the one thing that here in the north you've been anxious about, whether it's Ballymurphy or the one we're doing at the moment, or Bloody Sunday, is you want truth and accountability. And so this is an opportunity to do it for the Palestinians, even though we're thousands of miles away and it may be difficult. But so that's the interest we have in what might grow out of tonight. Who knows?
I know we have some Palestinian guests with us, so we would be interested later on your thoughts on why Palestine hasn't lodged or filed complaints with the ICC or ICJ. So we'll maybe come to that a wee bit later, but it seems they're very passive, or this is certainly something Abbas could do at the minute, as I understand, so we'll be talking about that a wee bit more later. The importance of the ICJ, one of the important factors is that if it determines there was genocide, then the ICC doesn't have to. And that's important because the ICC is seen as more as a Western puppet institution, so it might be very important to go to the ICJ as well. I wanted to quote that French lawyer you referred to, I think it's Gilles Diver, who's involved in the complaint to the ICC. And to quote him, he says, "You did not have anyone to defend you," and he's talking about Palestine, "but you now have an army of lawyers to defend you in the international and national courts." So I know you're also involved in an initiative, a petition, signed by probably over 1,000 lawyers now, an army of lawyers in this jurisdiction.
You signed it too.
I signed it too. were both signatories to it. So that was obviously calling for a ceasefire. Things had moved on. So what's perhaps the next steps? I know you're going to be doing more work around this for that initiative as well, where more than 1,000 lawyers. What could we do with that initiative that might help the situation as well?
Well, I think that you saw what happened yesterday in terms of the House of Commons, for what it's worth. So you've got a Labour Party which, the less I say about it, the better. You've got a Labour Party who's not producing, they can't even agree on a ceasefire, so you're hardly going to persuade them to be a body that approaches the ICC, because they could, as a part of the democratic system, they could do so on behalf of Palestinian members of the party or whatever. Anyway, they're not going to do it. The Conservative Party, as government, they're not going to do it. So we're back in a situation of the Russell Tribunal again. And there is a move to set the tribunal up again, but that's something that we'll have to see if we can get the lawyers together to do it again. But I think the big thing at the moment that could happen from here is that either a party who would be in government, if you had an assembly, like the Sinn Féin, for example, as a body, could approach the prosecutor, or the Taoiseach, and I gather apparently that's a possibility, also on behalf of the Republic. They could approach the ICC, or you can form a group surrounding, and it's important for it to have a centrepiece, and therefore if there are Palestinians here who've been, and I shouldn't think there's any Palestinian who hasn't been dramatically affected, so you've got an actual physical client, really helps to get that, because the more people because I know Karim Khan, and I appreciate, as far as I'm concerned, he's independent. As far as I'm concerned, all the dealings I've had with him, he's utterly honest, and therefore I think the more he's got a conscience, and I believe everybody's got a conscience if he can, dig it out, find it and expose it. The more groups that approach the ICC, the prosecutor, and say, you have an obligation to humanity, because otherwise this court will be brought into disrepute, and therefore in future, countries that don't pay any regard at the ground level, and you know as well as I do what the other countries are that are really hugely oppressive. They're just going to watch what's going on in the Middle East and think, well, why should we bother? But if they see the ICC is taking, as it has done over Ukraine, a very positive view, and it's not going to stand by, then I think it's just a small, as it were, step towards ensuring some form of justice in the longer run, rather than medieval bloodletting, which is what we're very close to.
Okay, I just wanted to talk briefly about a lawsuit filed in the US in the federal court by the Centre for Constitutional Rights, and it seeks a declaration that US officials have failed to prevent genocide, and it's also accompanied by an injunction which seeks an emergency order to prohibit any further US diplomatic support for Israel. So I just wondered whether, we talked about the international courts, whether in the domestic courts there were options for lawyers and campaigns, perhaps around the sale of arms to Israel by the British government, and we could have a different arena in the domestic courts to fight this issue as well.
Well, I just mentioned, I don't know whether you've heard of, what's it called, BIDS? There's a movement that's been, it started with South Africa originally, and that was an economic movement, if you like, so you can have all sorts of things in the courts and so on. And the reason I'm going to mention it now is because the government we now have is trying to forbid this whole situation arising. So that's going open to legal challenge, should be open to it. And that is what they did was they said, well, if you think a country or an organisation is acting illegally, according to the Wall judgment, you have to do everything within your power that's legal to bring pressure to bear on that outlaw, if you like, that person, that state committing these crimes. So the obvious thing is you don't buy materials coming from that source. And what the present government's saying is, because what's happened is not just individuals don't buy Dead Sea products, whatever you want to call them, whatever you can think of. And in the case of South Africa, it was fruit and so on. So there was a boycott, which does affect, but of course it always does affect the people on the ground as well. So it's a double-edged sword, but it's another way in which you can bring that pressure to bear. And what the present government is saying, when councils are doing that, councils are not using organisations that have contributed to the building of the wall in Israel, or there's a refuse company that has been lending its services to the government in Israel and so on. They say, right, we're not going to employ you here. Or people who've invested their money, withdrawing their money. Divestment, essentially, was the D bit of the bids word. So there's a battle to be had to defend the council's right to decide on your behalf, obviously, that they will not support regimes that indulge in violating international law. So there's another battle going on there. And of course, one of the big ones is arms. We're at the top in terms, the United Kingdom, as a provider of arms. And that's where there have been, and this is another whole area if you can get into, but protests. Protests getting more and more difficult, as you know. They've extended the definition of an extremist. I don't know whether you noticed that recently. It's anyone who undermines the principles and instruments of our democracy. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? I think there are certain people that will fall into that category, like Boris, Cruella. Anyway, need I go further? So, but it's seriously, the extension of the definition is linked to all the laws making it more difficult to protest, because there were people who were protesting in the road outside an arms fair, which they have every year in the arena in the City of London. And we should be not supporting, any more than the Americans are, sending arms that are going to be used or might be used, are capable of being used in violating international law. So there's another battle there, and I think lawyers have a role to play on that as well as individual citizens in making clear that opposition to it. That's, it's a team situation. We work together.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the floor. Hopefully we'll give you some ideas and initiatives that could be taken. But I'll pass it over to you. If anybody's any question, maybe you want to raise your hand, let us know. And yep, we'll start this gentleman here.
I'm Palestinian myself. My family is in Gaza, and we've been through the different wars. I grew up in Gaza myself, and I'm living in Belfast now over 6 years, and the island of Ireland over 25 years. And I lost family members myself throughout the different wars that we had. So Gaza, this is not the first war that Gaza had. This is the fourth major war from 2007. So my first, I know that all of this comes under the title of ethnic cleansing, because the last war, 2021, I was approached by a journalist from Belfast here, and he said to me, "You, the Palestinians, you have a country called Jordan. Why you Palestinians don't move to Jordan?" This was a question that was put to me by a journalist from Belfast, as you know from what side they are, and I had to explain to him that this is Palestine, this is our land, this is my grandparents' land, and we will go back to our grandparents' land. I mean, we are refugees in Gaza. Gaza is not where my grandparents are. My grandparents are from Palestine proper. Beside Java, that's where my village is. That's where all the Israelis are living right now. That's my land. That's what my grandparents wanted me to go back to. Okay, so that's my background. But what I wanted to ask you is, in the year 2014, we had a war, a major war, and we lost family members at that time. And you said in Palestine became an observer state in 2012. So at that time, 2014, we were an observer state in the UN. But then we had nobody was persecuted from the Israeli government. So we've had how many years? 9 years from the major war in 2014, where we lost thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, but none of the Israeli government or the Israeli army were persecuted. No, none of that. So what makes this different in this war? I mean, you're saying that they can be persecuted in the ICC. Well, what makes the difference between 2014 and 2023? Is there anything that is encouraging us as Palestinians to go to the ICC now and make our case? That's my question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think the big difference is this time, I'm not saying going to the ICC now is going to be, in principle, fundamentally different. I mean, the fact is, the one that we've just illustrated, dating back, they commenced an investigation and we're still waiting. So you're right, after all this time, that having recognized, it's a very slow process, having recognized Palestine as a state, having agreed jurisdiction, having opened an investigation, we're still waiting to see if anybody gets prosecuted. Now that's not that, I agree. You could say, waste of time. However, I'm doing what Palestinians are doing really, in a sense. I'm just clinging to the bit that's left there. We've got a prosecutor in there that's already started action. I mean, Putin isn't going to get arrested tomorrow, but behind the scenes it makes a difference because they can't travel in the same way that they did, and they run the risk. And we tried it, given the example you just given, myself and some others tried to arrest a member of the Israeli cabinet when they came to London Airport. However, I'm not sure who did it, but not too difficult to work out. The person concerned was tipped off on the plane. He didn't get off. And so they had to take him back to Israel. But it made news, it makes life difficult. So this time, the difference is, I think, unlike all the times before, somehow or another, Palestine gets glossed over. Palestine, is put to one side. People, it's a sore they don't really want to face. This time it is very, very different, it seems to me, because the scale of annihilation is, then it was embryonic, you could see it, and of course you lived there so you know what it's been like over the years, going back to 1948, so I realised the history, you've been persecuted, and then before that the Turks, the Ottoman Empire did exactly the same, so you've been an occupied people for hundreds of years, so I realise and sympathise with that. But there is a possibility here because I've done a lot of these meetings and there hasn't been a single person who's untouched by what is going on, because we're living as, I don't know whether you remember, an American author called Marshall McLuhan, who talked about, this is years ago, the global village, the possibility that actually we will live in a situation in which we are in instantaneous communication with each other on either side of the world. Well, that's happened. We now have it. And in a sense, we had it back in 2014 and 2012, I realised. But this one is on every screen everywhere. It's impossible. In fact, some people now are saying they just can't turn it on because the scenes are so horrific. So this time people will be saying and are saying, and maybe you're saying, well, not, yeah, I'm sure you are as well, what can we do about it? And, short of actually taking up arms as people did during the Spanish Civil War and went out there and so on, this is on a scale that we can't deal with unless collectively we use the machinery that people fought for after the Second World War, fought to set up, and especially Stefan Hessel, who spent to the end of his life. He wrote a book very similar to the one I've written, in fact, which went viral in the Arab Spring and caused people to, You know, collectively, when there's collectivity and people stand together, I mean, I don't have to say that to all of you here because you've been through troubles of your own, but I think the answer to your question is the scale of this is so big that everybody now is saying, literally to me, what are you going to do about it? What can we do? And so it seems to me the only opportunity we've got, and there is an opportunity, to put it on the agenda. And this has got, well, let me give you another example why I think it makes a difference. I need the newspaper. It's in today's newspaper. I think this matters. If you're one of the politicians concerned, this is, and that's why I think things could happen. French court issues warrant for Assad on war crimes charges. Now, of course he can be, you know, like Boris and the rest of them, you know, I'm not bothered, you know, whatever. He can't do that. Internally, he may, you know, begin to believe that. But once these sort of headlines start happening, the French have got a different system to ours, rather better on this front. There's something called a universal jurisdiction, and what we should be doing in the United Kingdom is importing international crimes into our domestic legislation. The incorporation, it's got erga omnes is the phrase, because it's universal. It's so bad that really all nations should have it in their domestic legislation that they should be able to arrest. Well, the United Kingdom hasn't done it as well as the French have. But this is just an example that if we can get the ICC to issue arrest warrants as part of an investigation for various people who it's obvious who they are, actually on both sides, the names are known. The Israeli know the names of the people responsible for the attack on the kibbutz and all the rest of it. They've got the names. And the names of the Israeli cabinet, because they go out and they're proud of it. They're out on television saying. So, in fact, it doesn't need a lot of investigation to come to the conclusion that certain people are liable to be arrested. It's not a conviction, it's just saying they are the sort of people for whom an arrest warrant should be made. So the difference now, I think, is that it would be difficult to go anywhere in the world, I think, and not find, you know, I can name a few places, but basically a human response to this which is horrifying. That's why what happened yesterday in the House of Commons, you know, they don't realise how out of touch they are, that they can't even agree on a possibility of a ceasefire. You know, that's just a suggestion, as if it would happen tomorrow. So I think, you know, it's not a satisfactory answer. I can't say it's going to happen overnight. You've waited hundreds of years, basically, and we're still making very slow progress. And what I would like to see as a result of all this, unfortunately, it sometimes does come out of desecration, as did the United Nations in the first place, that maybe people will eventually say, we can't go on like this in disputes, wherever they are, ending up with just blowing each other's brains out. This is, for anybody who's remotely intelligent or civilized, it makes no sense at all. Whereas before, I think it's been rather local, and it's been overlooked, you know, they've brushed it aside, and people get away with all sorts of fake news. So it's a situation which, so I think it's the level and the gravity of this one which will provide a momentum for change. That's what I hope. Anyway, sorry, do you want?
Just a follow-up on the same question, if you don't mind. Do you think the Palestinian Authority can play a role in this, as they are an observer state in the UN now, that as an observer state, as the Palestinian Authority have that, we can see live feed on Al Jazeera now, showing the hospitals, the mosques and the church and the UNRWA schools bombed day and night. So these live feeds that are shown on Al Jazeera, right? So can they not, the prosecutors, can they not use these feeds that are shown day and night for the last 40 years to prosecute Israel as a terrorist state?
Yes, the short answer is yes. because that's the other thing about the global village, is that evidence, but one has to be careful, plainly. I mean, none of us are stupid. What you see on television, you know, you used to say in the old days, you know, those of us who read newspapers, you know, don't believe everything you read in the newspaper. Don't believe everything you see on the screen, because I know that, you know, people are quite capable of fabricating what you see, fabricating the actual film, fabricating what's found, it's planted, it wasn't there in the first place, all that sort of thing. So it's available for a prosecutor to see, but there are some scenes that can't be fabricated, which can be shown on Al Jazeera or anywhere else. It's on our television screens. The desecration, the destruction is massive, and is it equivalent to what some Israelis were wanting, which is nuke them. It's equivalent to a nuclear bomb drop there. And so it will be very difficult for a prosecutor, in the face of that kind of universal evidence that's being produced, not necessarily the minutiae, but the bigger picture is too obvious to be ducked. Of course, you can delay it, you put it off, whatever, all the other things that happen. But I say, so you're quite right. There's stuff coming out all the time. I'm, I suppose, as a lawyer, a bit sceptical about what gets produced as evidence in all sorts of places, so I have to question it all the time. But the bigger picture here, I don't have to question it. It's very, very obvious. It's like saying, oh, you know, scenes of earthquake in Turkey, well, they made it up. No, they can't make that up. There are certain things that cannot be fabricated in this way. And this amount of desecration is almost, in its own right, a violation. You don't have to look very far. That's why I think it's different to 2014.
Any other questions? Yep.
Sorry, on technical issues, I mean, I like the idea, you know, from the ICC, but on technicalities, I mean, I remember before I was asked by a local solicitor, a lawyer anyway, about launching a judicial review into British arms shipment to Israel, and he said more likely it's winnable. But there was an issue that one of the technical issues was that they said they need legal aid to cover the court fees, and that they required a person who was unemployed so that they could apply to legal aid. So he asked me to quit my job if I was going to go ahead with the case and then become, on benefits, and then that way I can, it was impossible obviously for me. So this was a technical issues in terms of if somebody's going to take this case, that somebody's going to say the fees of the court are that much and therefore you need legal aid for this.
Yeah, I can deal with that. I mean, I wasn't a lawyer, so didn't actually leave your job. But the reality is that a judicial review is possible in the type of case you're talking about. The difficulty is finding someone with local standby who is affected by the issue, and then someone who is legal aid eligible. Without legal aid in place, you would run the risk of not only court fees, but much more significantly, if you lost the case on a legal point, then you can incur the cost of those who are defending the judicial review, the respondents, and that could be quite significant. So, yeah, I can understand the dilemma that was there, and it's difficult to find the right applicant. It's not just if you have a legal point and a good point to take, you must also find the right applicant to take that point, and that sometimes is a barrier, an obstacle to it.
I suppose, Paddy, Mohammed is talking about a judicial review process here, but in terms of taking a case to the International Criminal Court, how would that process be funded?
No, I don't think that wouldn't be the same kind of difficulty. I should say as well that some organisations are crowdfunding to assist people to take judicial reviews. That's been a recent phenomenon. I know Michael will be aware of this. It's probably more common in England than it is here, but certainly that's another option where you have a campaign or a movement who are enthused by the issue. Then that's another option as well to cover that potential cost. You can apply to the court as well, to the judge at the earlier stages, to cap the cost. as well. So there's an application to be made to the court and ask the judge for determination that the cost would be very, very limited, and the judge has an option to do that as well. So there are various things you can do as well in terms of taking something like that forward. And obviously lawyers in this jurisdiction, as they are in England and other places, are very interested in taking those cases or similar cases as to what you're referring to. My memory was there was some firm in Derry or thereabouts who were involved in this kind of issue and arms that were then being used or sold to Israel, but the case didn't get off the ground. I do recall talk about it. That's something that could be looked at again, I'm sure. I suppose the crowdfunding issue, I mean, it's been a big...
Yes, it's
big issue.
Because there have been cuts in legal aid, public funding. So most of the bigger ones that I've got involved in have relied upon approaching the public for crowdfunding. And on the whole, that has worked. But of course, cost of living, everything else that's going on that you all know about is making it increasingly difficult to raise money for the court costs that you're talking about here. It's not just the costs of your side, because if you lose, you have to pay the other side as well. So there's a risk, plain risk, and you have to have not only courage and also resilience, but you do have to have some access to resources, otherwise it can. And some people have had to sell their houses and all the rest of it. I don't need to go there for the moment. But in terms of the ICC, that's different, because there, if a case is begun, in the sense that if the prosecutor's persuaded that there is something to be examined, there is something to be investigated, and there is a trial to take place, all of those stages, they fund it. The bit is not funded is, for example, if you wanted here in Belfast to, as it were, coordinate a group that want to put a communication complaint into the ICC, then that will cost a bit of money to get everybody together, to get the evidence that you want, put it in a dossier, get perhaps a lawyer or two to make it look good and all the rest of it, use the right language and so on. So, but they're nothing like the same costs as a judicial review. And a lot of us, I can't commit Paddy, but I'm sure he does, we do pro bono work. It's increasingly difficult for us to do that because the paying work's gone down the chute as well. So we can't do it quite as much as we used to. But it is more achievable, the ICC approach is more achievable because you're dealing with administrative costs of collating a case, which is what the French lawyers have done, is collating a case and a dossier, if you like, which you give to the prosecutor and say, here you are. And sometimes you can take it to The Hague, which is quite an interesting publicity bit at the beginning, if you want to do it that way. You can go to The Hague and say, good morning, here you are, can we sit down with you for 5 minutes? It may not be the actual prosecutor, but somebody from this department would receive you. So the costs would be far less than they would be on a judicial review. And I don't think to do that is not prohibitive. The real key to it is there a will to do something, and have you got access to evidence that would create a good dossier? That's what it comes to.
Mark, you have a question?
I was thinking about Henry Kissinger. One aspect where he was brought before the courts and there was an arrest warrant for him if he stepped inside, I think it was French.
Yeah, it's French again, yes.
Jurisdiction. I suppose just I read recently about in order to look at culpability, you have the Israeli government, Netanyahu, etc., who are prosecuting the war. But is there also culpability for people who are complicit in that active prosecution? And I think of the likes of the British government, because they have suppressed things now about the SAT's role in Gaza.
Short answer is yes. Yeah, I mean, theoretically, practically, it may be difficult to prove it and get it before the court, but that's what the Wall judgment was saying. We all have a responsibility to, where there is a violation, to ensure that it stops. And in order that it stops, we have to put pressure on those who have a responsibility. So the British government has a responsibility if they have not, well, there's two things. One, putting pressure on straight away, or failing to do that, or worse, covering up the sort of material you're talking about. So yeah, it's a broad spectrum, and the universality of these international crimes was intended to, as it were, embrace a whole range. It's not just the perpetrators, but all those that support the perpetrators are liable to be brought before the court. And of course, a prosecutor would say, well, yeah, that's difficult. You know, our tentacles can't reach that far. We've got enough on our plate. And I've been in The Hague doing these cases, and sometimes they get exhausted. That they can't quite get everybody there, and they decide, well, we'll concentrate on the people who we can nail clearly, rather than spreading the net too wide. That's the problem. But theoretically, you're right.
Any other questions?
Hi,
Stephen?
just a wee bit sort of confused on the answer. It was brought up yesterday in Leinster House that they asked the Irish government to take this case to the ICC, and the vote was lost in the chamber. The Leo was on TV on a few occasions. I watched the news yesterday. He was alluding to some case already underway.
Yeah, I can tell you, I've seen
He
that.
says nothing's happening. So
No, basically what he's referring to, he was asked whether Ireland would file a complaint. South Africa has done so, I think, yesterday, or in the last number of days. So other states can't file them. NGOs have filed one. The French lawyers have done that on behalf of some residents of Gaza. The Irish government were asked about this, and Leo's answer was that this 2014 complaint is still live. You know, the one I referred to earlier that went to full investigation in March 2021, that because the prosecutor in the last week or so has determined that the current events are covered by that investigation, there was no need for the Irish state then to make their own complaint. I think it was an easy way out. South Africa went further and said no, even though that's the case, we're filing our own complaint as well. So Ireland could have followed suit. And other countries may do so in the coming days and weeks, and depending how things go. But it was an easy way out to say that, you know, the prosecutors are already doing it. It's pointless us doing it, but of course there's huge symbolic value in doing it, and international solidarity as well. And other countries might step forward, because in fairness to the Irish government around the ceasefire was pretty early in the international community. You've seen, I think, Macron come after it. So there is important, I think, symbolic, even if that investigation has already covered it. But there is value in states then filing complaints as well. Of course, it's embarrassing, but I think the sidestep it. You don't know if you want to comment on that, you maybe agree?
No.
Harry,
So ICC follow through just hypothetically, so the current 2014 one's name, and that concludes and it takes in the current sort of onslaught from Israel and so on. And the successful outcome is that Israel was found guilty for trial. I don't know what that would look like or whatever. So what happens next from them? And what happens to Israel and all that, you know?
Well, because there's the ICC, unlike the International Court of Justice, can arrest people. I mean, if you're talking about the immediate ramifications, if it was to follow the route which is mapped out for the ICC, they issue an arrest warrant, and then obviously if they can arrest, they do. You can be tried in your absence, so it gets even more difficult. But there are people who do get arrested regularly because, you know, they have ways and means of tracing where people are. And at the end of the day, you know, perpetrators have an arrogance about their lives, and they kind of feel they're immune, but they're not, and they're given away by other people and so on. So the procedure should be arrest, indict, and go to trial. Then if they're convicted, individually, as individual response. This is supposedly the golden egg in this whole procedure, is not trying to divulge it onto or divert it onto corporate responsibility. The individual is responsible. That individual can then be locked up. Now, if the person is in custody in The Hague, which they've got all these facilities at the ICC, so they can detain them. And Milosevic, who you may remember his trial, he was locked up there. They found him in the end. They never thought they would, but they did. And they got him there. He was tried, but of course it was getting too hot to handle, so he died in circumstances where no doubt somebody made sure that he died. I don't know what actually happened, whether he just committed suicide or what. But he was in custody. So They have the facilities to do that. They also have the facility to say whether they do it in this particular case. They can return the convicted person to the country that should have tried them in the first place. But they're not very keen on doing that because they're frightened that the person goes back to the original country and gets released. So they probably serve their sentence. Whereas it wouldn't apply to the United Kingdom. So if it was a United Kingdom person, they probably would return it to the United Kingdom and then they'd be incarcerated in the United Kingdom. But that's what should happen. If you mean what happens next beyond the actual case, assuming one can be got off the ground. I mean, what I think should happen, which of course is, I hope it's not pie in the sky. I want to really go back to the drawing board that Stefan Hessel started doing in 1944, 45 through to 48. We have to reorganize international governance. We are a global village now, and therefore what happens, you know, thousands of miles away, I talk about indivisibility of humanity. What's happening there affects me just as much as what happens in this room. And therefore, we need an international government that recognises the need to ensure that you don't get countries, which of course you do at the moment, like Russia, who says, well, you can't send your grain to Africa or whatever, and all these interruptions of civilized life by nations who live on might being right rather than the rule of law. So it's putting the rule of law back into centre place. That is a huge task, psychologically and politically, to get people persuaded back to a situation they were in 1945, and it's back to the magnitude of what happened in the Second World War. And that's what I'm saying. It was that magnitude that drove people to say we can't let it happen again. And I think it's the magnitude of what's happening now, hopefully, will promote an opportunity for those of us who are concerned about changing things, is to start changing things from the top right to the bottom in United Nations. I'm not sure I've got an alternative, because if we don't do that, I ask it regularly, nobody's come up with an alternative. I mean, there is no alternative to, well, there is one. I'm going to, how long have we got? I brought a book, I don't always bring it out, but there is another route. Let's see if I've got it here. I'm going to hold this up, see how many people know this one. Who knows about this man? From Palestine, you might know. You might know.
Yes, that's a professor from a professor in
Yeah.
Gaza, Abu Muirigh.
That's it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. I've met him, and in fact I endorsed the book originally
Yes.
when he wrote it, and I compare him to somebody here in the north. I'm going to mention the name, see if it means anything to you. Richard Seymour. Anybody know that name? No, they don't. That's not his real name. I'll come back to him if there's time. But what the object of this story, if you haven't read the book, I think there is a documentary. There's a play which, because he contacted me, he's now in Canada the other day. I want to bring the play back, and it's been produced, interestingly, in Israel, but not, as far as I know, in Europe. The object is simple. He is a gynecologist, born and trained in a refugee camp in Gaza. Yeah, Jabalia.
Yeah.
And he took the view, having become trained in that particular expertise, that he wanted to, as it were, devote his time equally to people, whoever they are, wherever they are. So in fact, he worked in Gaza hospitals and he worked in Israeli hospitals. And so this went on for quite some time. And interestingly, one of the hostages at the moment is a woman, Israeli woman, who's done the same, not in the medical field, but in relation to children. I don't think she's been released yet. And her family said she would not, approve of any of this, but she struggled to do what this man did, is cross the border. But one day, he was the foreign minister of the time, Lipsy, I've forgotten the rest of her name, foreign Israeli minister was on television. You can see all this on YouTube if you've got a minute tonight. You need to watch it and you go, oh my God. Lipsy is being interviewed. She was foreign minister. Now she's the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom. Very abrasive, very outspoken, not surprising, whatever. She's being interviewed by on a national Israeli radio television program. The presenter of that interview, who was doing the interview, knew this man, knew this surgeon. And he had his mobile phone open as he was doing the interview, and it sent him a message from this man. And he stopped the interview. It's all recorded. And he asked her, he said, what is going on? What was going on was an Israeli tank had drawn up outside this surgeon's home. He wasn't at home, he was in Israel. And a shell from the tank went straight through the bedroom window of his home and killed 3 daughters. The presenter, because he was a friend and knew him, stopped the interview because he, the surgeon, was being prevented from going back into Gaza to see what's happened to his home. The presenter went to the border and persuaded the border guards to let him through because essentially he was a friend of Israel in that sense. He'd devoted some of his time. But of course that doesn't matter when you're a border guard, you're not going to let somebody through, and that's it. And they did let him through. But the book is born out of what happened afterwards. He recognised what we all recognise, namely, you can go on doing this and hating each other, and there's obvious hatred right there on the ground, for reasons that are natural and understandable, but we have to get beyond that threshold, which is what he tried to do. So he went on, although he wasn't politely welcomed back into the Israeli hospital, but he did go on doing the work he'd always done, even though he'd lost, not all his children, was one survived, but the 3 gone, and he lost his wife, I think, quite separately, nothing to do with the shell through the bedroom window.
Actually, he lost this time. This time he lost a number of...
This time.
He was 2 days ago with Chris Morgan.
Yeah.
Yes, and he lost a number.
Well,
yes.
You're quite right, and the end of the story is in the end he felt he couldn't go on, and so he works in, I think, Toronto University. He's in Canada. And he wrote the other day, and our concern was obviously for him and the example that he set. And this is not a story that's told regularly on your news programs or current affair programs. And myself and a theatre director in London said, you know, would you be prepared to speak now about the example you set? And he said, no, he can't do it anymore at the moment because of what you've just said. More members of his family. And I read a text to Paddy a bit earlier from a Palestinian law student who I've got to know, who feels she just wants to know what the point is anymore. And you know, I feel for him that he's given up so much. And of course, but there are many people like him. And the Richard Seymour here did exactly the same. I don't know. I'm going to tell the story of Richard Seymour just quickly because it's another person I've met, and there's absolutely riveting story. I was doing Bloody Sunday, and a lawyer in Bloody Sunday said, I've got somebody I'd like you to meet, but we're going to meet in Dublin. So we went down to Dublin and went to this restaurant. The friend lawyer was there, and this other person who he'd said nothing about at all. I don't know, I can't remember what his real name is now. And we were having this meal, and I don't know whether you ever get this situation, anyway, it happens to me quite a bit, you know. I suddenly think, oh my God, you know, And I looked at him and I said, we've been sitting here and eating, chatting, and you're blind. And I thought, oh my God, what am I saying? He said, that's fine. That's fine. I'm glad you said it. Most people dance around the tulips and don't say it. And I said, well, I feel terrible. I didn't realise at the beginning. He said, we didn't want you to realise until I've been with you for a long time. So I said, what's the purpose of this? There must be some other purpose then, but we come all down. He said, yeah. He said, I was blinded by a British Army rubber bullet in Derry.
Richard Muir.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's
Richard
close.
Muir.
He changed his name to Seymour for a radio program that he had, which may still be going. I know he's still alive, because again he communicated not so long ago. And he then told a story to me that I knew nothing about. Having been blinded, he decided, and you then probably, maybe you all know the story of what he did thereafter. He decided he was going to, as it were, do what this man did. In other words, cross the border. But he did it in I thought, an extraordinarily intelligent, sensitive and clever way. He raised money in Derry, not for the north of Ireland or the south of Ireland or for any Irish people at all. He raised money for an African village in Gambia in order to provide them with basic water facilities, irrigation and wells and pumps. And then what he did, having raised enough to do that, he said, I think it was 10 Protestant children and 10 Catholic children, he said to their parents, who'd given money anyway, I want to take this group and show your children what has been achieved in the African village. And it worked, a complete miracle, because the kids loved it. It was a trip and all the rest of it, and they saw amazing things happening, and they got to know kids that didn't have any of this. And when they came back, this is the extra bit of the story he tells, which is they became, unlike the schools, integrated. They made their friendships, and they were saying to their parents, whatever the feelings, religious, political or whatever, they're saying, we want to go for tea or sleepover or whatever it is. And he continued doing exactly that and making a difference. Of course it's incremental, of course it's below the horizon and you don't see it much, you wonder, and some people have never heard of him. But these two examples, there are only two, I've got a whole list of others, don't worry, we're going to go through them all. People like this. So in a sense, there is an alternative, which you do by personal example. It's one hell of a sacrifice, not all of us can do it. But on the other hand, within everybody is the possibility of crossing the boundary. Because unless we're prepared to do it, and thereby create a new institution, the kind I'm talking about. So it's a spiritual belief that I've got, not a religious one, that I've got towards people who are utterly remarkable, and there are many more than we realise. Probably there are some sitting in this room, I don't know, who never talk about it. You don't know they've done it until somebody else broadcasts it. Sorry, it's a bit of a diversion.
I'll take another question, gentlemen here.
So can I bring you back to the legal issues again here? Are there any legal avenues for reparations to be paid for this destruction that's happening in Gaza? Every time Israel conducts a war on the Palestinians, they internationally and the Arab countries and that, they construct this sort of reconstruction funds and so on. So Israel doesn't end up paying anything for that. And even the weapons that they use, the Americans send them replacements and better replacements for that. But are there any legal avenues there that can be explored to force them to pay for what they do?
Well, yes, there would be legal avenues if, in fact, the international institutions we've been talking about could operate properly, but they can't. It can be done internationally on the back of, for example, reparations, which might come on the back of a case at the International Court of Justice or the ICC or the United Nations itself, but you try and impose it. People just refuse to pay. That's the problem.
And that's the end of the story. If they refuse to pay, that's it.
Yeah, in other words, at the end of the day, you've got to have an institution and a set of rules that people are prepared to respect and sign up to, not just sign as a matter of just a gesture, but really mean it. Because of course the problem with the ICC has been funding, just for the court itself. Because the Americans said no, they didn't sign up. Why? Frightened of being in the dock. So it's been starved of money, and it's getting more difficult, for the ICC at the moment, because the whole process is politicised behind the scenes. So there will be people saying, don't you go there, don't you go there. So getting a perpetrator to pay for what's gone on, we're a long way from that. You're right, that's what should happen. But we can't get there at the moment because, the guts of the international organisation has been, drawn out of it. It's just, there's no willingness to pursue it to that extent. That's why there is a man there now at the helm of the ICC, and we've got to try and make him do the job he was set up to do.
Okay, we're nearly out of time. We're going to take one more question. Okay, this gentleman.
Thank you very much for your valuable lecture, actually. And just there's a
Yeah, sorry,
notion,
I didn't mean it to be a lecture.
there's a notion that we hear all the time from government officials, from the press, from everybody almost, that Israel has a right to defend itself.
Oh God.
Against whom? Since when the occupier, a criminal occupier, has a right to defend against his victims? It's ludicrous, and it's a lunatic idea indeed.
Well, I think the way I usually illustrate it is by saying, even a convicted criminal has the right to defend himself in prison if he's attacked. So it's not so much looking at the occupation itself. Obviously is illegal, and there's been all of that. However, if you get the kind of attack that you do have, that happened on the 7th of October, then you have a right to defend yourself at that moment in time if you're there. Well, of course they weren't there, then they got there in the end. And you're entitled to pursue the people who you've identified as the attacker and all the rest of it. And you can do preemptive strikes. You don't have to wait till something happens. If you think something is going to happen, you can take defensive action. But the whole original prospect was that you would only be able to do that until such time as the United Nations themselves stepped in with their own independent peacekeeping force. So you would have to stop at that point, which might be a week or so down the line, when the United Nations would step in. But in addition to that, the Charter is saying effectively, although you can defend yourself, that doesn't mean to say you can defend yourself any way you like. In other words, if you think defending yourself means Palestine, a Palestinian means Hamas means terrorist, because I got an idea that the British authorities thought certain areas of Belfast and Derry, Republican, nationalist, IRA, whatever, they became synonymous. So, you can't just label and say, right, that's it, we can move in. I know the British Army tried to do it with bulldozers and all the rest of it, just as the Israelis are trying to do it now, which is blanket bombing. And I'm not averse to it, and it's very interesting that Netanyahu is now using what the Brits did in Dresden, Second World War, blanket bombing. That's a war crime. And more controversial, but late in the day for me to introduce this one, Hiroshima. And there have been people on television recently, just this last week while I've been here, I watched a bit, where the people were saying, war veterans saying, but for Hiroshima we would have lost millions more. So there's an argument tucked away in there, but theoretically you're not allowed to do absolutely anything. Once you've identified the attacker, you can defend yourself reasonably and in proportionate to the attack. So obviously if you attack with guns, you can fight back with guns or whatever, and tanks and so on. But what they're doing is well beyond self-defense. And the problem is that the media either don't want to or are not describing it as being, what the limits to self-defense are. It takes you know, somebody, and a lawyer to write it out for them, and then they sometimes pay lip service to it, but it's out of control. It's out of control.
Just very quick. From your experience, do you think winning the case against Israel and like whoever in the Israeli government, is it if individuals
Yes.
who are living in Europe take the case to the ICC, or in organizations like the UNRWA or the Red Cross take the case against them, or states take the case against them? So got three options to take the Israeli government to the international court. Which of these three would you choose? What would give you the winning?
None of them, because that's not what happens. Sorry, probably me haven't made it clear. ICC, only one person can bring the case. You can complain to the prosecutor in a communication on behalf of the Red Cross or any of the organisations you've talked of, but you're not taking the Israeli government to court any more than the people put on trial in Nuremberg or Tokyo at the end of the Second World War were governments. They weren't governments. The whole point that Stefan and others were making is, at the end of the day, that's an easy way out. The difficult way is saying, actually, you did it. You did it. It's your personal, individual liability. So the first point is you're not taking a government to court. You're saying how successful you can be. You can take members of the government to court, obviously. So, Minister of Defence and so on. You can take them, they're obvious candidates. You take them. But it's not the Red Cross that are taking them. The Red Cross can complain, and I think I read something yesterday, they're wondering why the Red Cross hasn't been there and complaining a bit more than it has. But, you know, or MAP, Medical Aid for Palestine is another one. So, they would give the prosecutor the materials, just as a group here could do that. Just, here you are, this is the dossier that we've experienced as members of the Red Cross on the ground, or whichever organisation it is. Then at that point, if the prosecutor decides, as he did in relation to the original approach, 2014, as he did, then it becomes his baby, not the Red Cross or anybody else. He prosecutes individuals who he's identified as being responsible for whatever's happened and he can have a series of cases, because it could be what happened in the hospital in Gaza or what happened on the frontier or whatever, in different places. It doesn't have to be the whole scenario. So he may have better evidence in relation to a specific case, like the entry into the hospital yesterday. Because the soldiers did it all on screen, as you pointed out.
Okay, I'm going to bring matters to a close. Just want to thank Shane and his team at Áras so kindly for hosting us. Thank you all for coming out. Clearly this moves people, this issue. This was arranged at very short notice, but we've had a great turnout. And finally, just obviously want to thank Michael for his passionate call to action. Hopefully you will take that call up. Go to meet him, Alvin.